Welcome to the Culture, Faith, and Politics podcast. I'm Pat Kahnke, and once again I'm here with Pastor Dave Johnson, formerly from Church of the Open Door in Minneapolis, and now the Executive Director of Things That Remain. And we've been talking for a month or more now about Tim Alberta's book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. And we're going to continue that discussion today with chapter 9 of the book. And Dave, hello.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Hey, Pat.
Yeah, before we dive into this chapter, Dave, I wanted to bring something up that on the YouTube channel we get a lot of comments, and I don't know how many of those you're able to see, but I thought
Well, I'm
I just
not
wanted
able
to
to
deal
see
with.
them because I don't check them.
Oh, yeah,
I love it that you do.
right,
Yeah.
yeah, and so one of the comments that we've been getting kind of regularly, there are quite a few people who are listening to us talk or watch other things that I do on the channel, and a kind of consistent comment is, well, it's nice to hear you guys talk about these things, but don't you realize that these negative things that you're saying about where the evangelical movement is going lately, that's just what it's always been. Like, don't you realize that the problem really is just Christian faith in general? Some people say that, or the Christian faith has always been about power and control. And, I respond a little bit in the comments. A few times I have, to clarify things, and then I get to make these other videos just by myself where I can deal with some of these things. But I thought I'd give you a chance, Dave, to just, does that strike anything in you that
Yeah.
you'd want to help someone think through that a little bit?
Yeah. My first response is they're right.
Mm,
But I think it's part of why we're doing the podcast, because the public witness of the church is not in a good place right now. And that's what it's part of what is motivating me to do this whole thing. The idea that it's always been, I think we need to differentiate some terms, and because they've just
yeah.
gotten lost. Christendom is different than Christianity. Christendom is when Christianity is the official religion of Major League Baseball. That was
Mm,
supposed to be a joke.
sure. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And authentic Christianity, followers of the way of Jesus. We were talking about this earlier, Pat. They never called themselves Christians. It wasn't until Acts
Mm,
16 that they were in Antioch and people were looking at them and almost in a pejorative way. They were certainly being sarcastic. They called them, I can't remember the Greek word, but it was Christian. It was Christ-like. They were mini
mm,
Christs. And it was like, they're
mm,
just like a mini Christ. And they kind of embraced it, and then they became that. But my thing is, I wish we could roll back the tape and kind of make this rule that you don't get to ever call yourself a Christian. You don't.
mm,
Other people need to notice Christ in you and say, "I see he's like a little Jesus." And
mm,
anyway, so this does get to this guy or these people who say Christianity has always been about power, because that troubles me about the public witness of the church. But in Antioch, when they said those people are little Christs, that was a public witness that is one I would love to see. That we
mm.
started getting accused of being more like Jesus. That would be great.
Yeah. Right.
Now you're talking about authentic faith in following the way of Jesus, not faith that if I believe the right thing, I go to heaven when you die. I die. That's not the story anyway. So
Yeah.
it's weird, because
Right.
I would love to have a conversation with people like that, because I agree with them, but I would like to help them would just sort out. And yes, I agree with you, sadly, that we don't see a lot of that, the
Yeah.
real thing.
Yeah. I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this chapter, gets into basically looking at a whole bunch of this type of person in the wild, I guess. It's in Nashville, Tennessee,
Mhm.
and it's at Ralph Reed's Road to Majority conference, and Ralph Reed has this Faith and Freedom Coalition, is what he calls it now. And his background, Ralph Reed's background, is kind of interesting because he was this big political operative back in the 80s and has been ever since. And Alberta writes, for the past 30 years, no person has done more to organize, mobilize, and manipulate the political sensibilities of American Christians than Ralph Reed. I think he's probably right. I think he probably has that much influence. And he became a Christian, I guess, in the mid 80s. And he says that before that, he had been, this big time political operative, used dirty tactics, that sort of thing.
He still
And
does.
none of that really changed. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. It didn't change.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the quotes that I think kind of sums him up, he gave this quote in 1991 to a newspaper. He said, "I do guerrilla warfare. I paint my face and travel at night. You don't know it's over until you're in a body bag." I thought, yeah, so that's a way for a Christian to talk, and I can understand people who would look at us and say, "You've always been about power and
Mhm.
control,"
Well, he
because
has.
it's like, yeah,
Ralph Reed
yeah,
has.
and
Yeah.
yep, and a good number of people follow him,
Yep.
and it works, like in 1994, Newt Gingrich, with the help of Ralph Reed, Reed founded the Christian Coalition, before that with Pat Robertson, and with the help of them, Newt Gingrich did this contract with America and took over the House of Representatives in 1994. It worked, this sort of mobilizing Christians around some of these issues paid off in some of these congressional races. And I remember that time. So I just feel like I need to own a little bit of my involvement in this. So this was before I went into ministry. And I was super involved, like I've mentioned many times, in the pro-life movement. And the rest of the Christian Coalition agenda actually kind of turned my stomach even back then. But I was involved in the pro-life movement, so I saw these people as, they were in the same fight, and
Mhm.
so I was happy when in 1994 the House of Representatives turned Republican. Now I look back on it and I have like all sorts of regrets, things that I didn't see, things where I was emphasizing the wrong things in my own faith and stuff. And I was young, and this is part of our growth, But I'm just reminded of my own involvement when I read this section. These sound like the people that I used to be,
Mhm.
with this one huge difference. The huge difference is that this coalition or this conference shows, where that sort of thing that I was involved in a little bit at the start, where it can go. It shows the sort of the rotten fruit of this, because when I was involved in it, it was still in its early stages, all this organizing and being political. And now this conference, what's very different about it is it's just rife with like really ridiculous conspiracy theories. It's there's rip-offs going on, people selling vitamins and stuff that are basically fake, like they're just fleecing the people.
Mhm.
And I just see it's not different in substance, but it's different in that it's just achieved like a full expression of, it started in the wrong place, it started in an unbiblical place, and we're seeing how over the decades it's just morphed into, it's just gotten worse.
Yeah.
And
But what's
yeah.
what's interesting and tricky, and I think I can even see how people could get sucked into it and why you did. Like there's an
Mhm.
agreement on certain issues, maybe,
Right.
and you see somebody fighting for that issue. And I think the drum I keep hitting every time it pops up, and that's why I'm doing this with you. It's
Mhm.
it's the way uh, changes everything. If you use a kingdom of this world tactic to accomplish what you think is a good thing, even a kingdom of God thing, but if you use a kingdom of this world tactic, like lying, exaggerating, pointing the finger at someone else, or even just we're going to have more of us than them, we win, you
Mhm.
lose the kingdom. It's
Yeah.
why massive numbers of people look at Christianity and say what that guy said to you. It's
Mhm.
always been about power because we have
Right.
forgotten the way of Jesus. Uh, because if we're losing our country and if God has been taken away, and then we have to fight for that, and so the rules all change. and I don't see anything that looks anything like Christianity, any of it.
Yeah, exactly. And I know that like back in the day, most of the people who were involved in this movement, because I knew some of them, not the big names, I mean, locally in Minnesota, none of them, if I were to take them into the future and say, look at what's happening, look at this conference that Tim Alberta attended, look
Mm.
at the people who are speaking, look at the things that they're saying, this is where we're headed. None of them would have wanted it. They all would have said, "You're being an idiot. Of course, that's not where it's headed."
Yeah, you're the
They
one
would
stirring up
not
the
have
fear,
believed it.
right?
Right?
You're the one stirring up
Yeah,
fear, right?
yeah. They would have said, "No way." But it's like what it's become. When you look back in through the history of it, it's like it was always founded in. It was founded in lies. It was founded in worldly tactics. It was founded in the wrong priorities, and a lot of people using, as you say, God's name
Yeah.
for things that aren't about God.
And you
So
don't have to go back as far as 1991, whenever that was for you, Pat.
yeah,
If two, okay, it's 16 is when Trump got elected overwhelmingly, with overwhelming support from white evangelicals, 81%. If you would have gone 2 years before, just 2 years, like, okay, do 2014, and you would have asked me or you, most
hmm
evangelicals, if a thrice married serial adulterer who brags about sexual assault on women because he can, because you're powerful, because you're rich, you just grab him by the whatever you want to grab him
hmm
by. Access
hmm
Hollywood quote from him. I'd have told you were
hmm
out of your mind. But now
right,
he's being touted as if he were a kind of savior. Um, yeah, it's just bizarre.
yep,
I don't even have the energy to try to argue people out of that. If that's what you believe, wow, I got to go where people don't believe that, because I don't want any of that on me.
yeah. I made a decision when I fired this channel up again, like a year ago or something like that, because I'd been really involved in the 2020 race, but then I took some time off, and I made a decision this time that I'm not trying to speak to those people,
Hmm.
because it is just like I've said several times on the channel, they need something that I can't offer
Yeah.
in just an online video or something like that. I think you only get better from that sort of thing through like loving relationships with people who care about you and are able to walk alongside you as you sort of dismantle some of the false things that are going on. I care about them, but I also don't have the energy to try to talk people out of that, from afar, you know. So,
Generally, I agree with you, Pat. But generally, I mean, it's almost like anything. If they're an alcoholic or there is an addiction issue, this one too, to pull someone out of having drunk the Kool Aid, um,
mhm,
the key would be somewhere along the line. I'm not sure how it would look. It would have to quit working. Like they would.
mm,
It's not like a good talk will turn them. It would have to quit
right,
working. There would have to be something that they experience and see that goes, this isn't working anymore, or um,
mm,
because anything less than that generally uh, won't change them. People
yeah,
will
and
change
what
until they have to.
right, and what offends me so much about like this chapter, the things that we see in this chapter is that conversation you and I just had is the opposite of what people like Ralph Reed are doing. Somebody like Ralph Reed and others in this chapter, not only, I mean, what they're doing is feeding it. So they're feeding the insanity and they're profiting off the insanity. And an example of that, the other one who this one is about is Paula White. Paula White gets brought, in this conference that Alberta's at. He Alberta describes her as basically the star attraction. Paula White was the star attraction. There was this huge buzz when she was getting, you know, introduced at the stage and stuff like that. Paula White was Trump's pastor, if you can call her that. I think he identified her as his pastor. She's a prosperity gospel person, and she was part of Trump's evangelical advisory board. Paula White, um, one thing when I see that, she was part of the evangelical advisory board, she's an example of how Trump attracts the worst people from every profession around him. So it's like, if you talk to attorneys, they say, yeah, he's got some of the most corrupt attorneys, starting with Roy Cohn way back in the day. He's got some of the most corrupt attorneys. So attorneys despise the people who are surrounding, the attorneys who are surrounding Trump. Medical people, he attracts like these medical people who will go with whatever weird conspiracy things he wants to promote about
Yeah,
medical things.
use beliefs. Yeah,
Yeah, and
yeah.
so the same way
Where's COVID?
the same way the Christian leaders around him, most Christian leaders are just appalled at these people and say, no, this is terrible. These people shouldn't have this platform, but they're exactly the ones that he draws around him. And Paula White is like the prime example of that. So she's got this prosperity gospel. And the one thing I want to say about it, I had to think about, okay, so this is a Christian nationalist conference, basically. So there's that heresy going on, whether they call it that or not. And then there's this prosperity gospel heresy going on. And I had to think, why are these together? The Christian nationalism thing, I think, is motivated by fear, motivated by wrath against the other. The prosperity gospel, I think, is motivated by greed. I think the reason that these work together is that they're both speaking to a group of people who they feel powerless in life. They feel dispossessed. They feel like they're on the outside looking in at it's a hard place to be. And so you've got people who come and speak to this. So the one is promising power within the culture. The other one is promising wealth. But they're both heresies that are kind of working together here in this conference. And I don't know, what do you think of that?
Well, I think everything you said is true. The prosperity is about greed. That the nationalism is about power. I think the other thing that's consistent with both of them is heresies and dangerous. I think really dangerous. Both of them, they have their cause. Okay, nationalism. The playbook of the nationalists at the Ralph Reed, what's it called? I can't remember the
Faith and
whatever.
Freedom Coalition. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Road to Majority Conference.
That was it. The Road to Majority event. Is they instill fear. The sky is falling. They're going to take your guns. They're coming for you. Blah, 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 all that stuff. But if you get people afraid, then they will do anything. We have to do this. The end justifies the means. And that bothers me. Then you start hearing them demonize whoever their rival is, their vermin, their pedophiles, just lie about it. All that's irritating. The worst part to me, they use God's name. They use God's name. God is on our side. And Paula White, the prosperity theology is all about coming to God for what he can do for you. And, I read Joel Osteen and some of these other guys. I've only read them to kind of go, is this really what they said? And in
Right.
these, it's so attractive because if you pray believing, don't just believe, you got to expect. If you really start to, now you're at an advanced level of faith. And what he's talking about is getting a parking spot because you're running late, or getting a table at a fancy restaurant that you didn't have if you believe, and really don't just believe it, expect it. I got favor from God. It's bullshit. And they're using God's name to get this. It has nothing, there's not a whiff of the Sermon on the Mount in the prosperity theology. There's not a whiff of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the ones who get first class upgrades. No, I didn't say that.
And one of the tragic things about it that I experienced as a pastor is that it's a non-falsifiable belief system, this prosperity thing and health and wealth. And so I had people who were like buying into it, but were dealing with, say, chronic pain, just as an example, dealing with chronic pain. And if the pain didn't go away, it was because they had a lack of faith.
Right.
So it's like it takes the focus off of Jesus and puts it onto you, onto your faith, and so if I'm not wealthy, if these things aren't working out, I just have a lack of faith. It's not that these people are teaching something false,
because
you know, and
God wills you to be wealthy, and He wants you to be
mhm,
healthy. He wants you to be
right.
um yeah, you're right. We used to get a lot of people at Open Door, and I just said earlier that it just has to quit working. I remember there
Mm,
was a time when we would get a steady stream of people from a church close by us that was totally prosperity, and they would come to our church
mm,
when their baby didn't get well.
mm,
When they played that whole thing out, they just believed and believed and believed and believed, and the baby died anyway, or they didn't get the job anyway. And if you do that long enough and it doesn't work after a while,
mm,
it's like gambling, Pat. I have a friend
mm,
whose son wanted don't know if he could go gambling, and he was of a certain age that it was okay to do it, but he said, I will, but if you win, I forbid you to go. Because if this works for
mm.
you, if this voodoo way of believing really expect it, and you get a table, wow, now you're in. And now
Yeah.
it's not biblical faith. I have a friend, we talk about this all the time, that most people, like, let me just say many people who call themselves Christians, I think we even unwittingly, Pat, you and I probably have things that as part of our growing, we had a deal with God. We didn't know it, but the deal was something like this: forget prosperity.
Mm,
I'm going to have a great marriage if I don't have sex before marriage. If I don't do this thing or do that thing, and we just have this deal. If I keep all the rules all along the way, then God, that's my part, and God's going to do His part. And here's a flash: it doesn't work like that. And when it doesn't
right.
work like that, if your faith is built on that, that's when you're in for a very, I think, important crash, because
Right.
that God and that deal that you had with God, He didn't sign on that one. You did.
Yeah.
And if you want to know God, you might need to start over from scratch. And the
Right.
prosperity thing is just a vivid example of, and when we say prosperity, I'm glad you expanded it, because the people I know who are into prosperity, it includes praying for healing. And if you
Right.
didn't get healed, there's all sorts of shame
Right.
with your faith. There can't be any other reason. And it's just, yeah,
Yeah.
I was thinking about this in preparation for this. I'm thinking, do people, I don't think they're all stupid.
No. No.
No, but it feels like that. I don't know what to say for to.
Right.
How do you believe that? Anyway,
Yeah, yeah, I know it. I don't know the answer to that, but I know that it's not about intelligence. It's
no,
about something deeply seated that, you know, it's desires that we have. It's wanting to make sense of things that a lot of things happen in life that are just brutal,
yeah.
and you sort of want someone to help you make sense of that.
And what
And I
bothers me
think
too,
that's where a
that's
lot of it
making
comes from.
sense. It becomes a Christian version of voodoo, or
Mm,
something we would call a pagan religion. Like, if I do this or sacrifice that or learn this way
mm,
to pray, I can manipulate God to do what I want. And it's like, well, if I choke a chicken over here and put him over a fire, and now you're a pagan. I would obviously spot that as being pagan, but
right.
yes, so it's not that different.
Yeah, so that's what we see at this conference. That's why I say there's like dueling heresies at this conference. There's the
Yeah.
whole Christian nationalism thing, and there's the whole health and wealth thing going on. But I think that they're both trying to appeal to people who are in a vulnerable place and are willing to give money, you know, willing to give power to people who will try to help them to make sense of you know, hardship, uh, try to help them, give them, you know, power over their culture a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, you know, you had talked about a little bit about this whole end justifies the means thing. You know, that was something that you saw in in this conference. And did you want to expand on that? Uh,
Well, only that's um, what I talked about was, you and I talked in chapter 9. We're just seeing different players, but they have the same
mm,
playbook. And the
yeah,
playbook is instill fear, they're coming for us. And that if you can get people to buy into that, and maybe there is kind of a underlying sense of fear, there's a loss of control. Things are going on in the culture that I'm concerned about deeply. But if you can stir up that fear, uh, and then start saying we have to fight, it all of a sudden the danger that we're in and we got to act now kind of spirit makes it pretty easy to jettison whatever restraint you might have had. And so the end
Right.
justifies means, because it is worth whatever it is that we have to do to
Hmm.
make sure the bad guys don't win and we do. And now you're in
Yeah,
real.
and in this conference, in this chapter, we see an example of that playing out with Herschel Walker. Basically, the the Republicans were really wanting to win back the Senate seat in Georgia, and so at the conference they have Herschel Walker there talking, and to me, it's just I thought as a guy from Minnesota, I, I can tell you this whole end justifies the means thing. The Vikings tried to do that, and you'll remember this, Dave, where they basically mortgage. I just think this is like if you understand football a little bit, this whole thing, this Herschel Walker thing, is a metaphor to me for what Christians are doing to try to gain power. So the Vikings mortgaged their whole future for Herschel Walker. He was going to be the savior that came in and gave Dallas like all of years worth of draft picks and all these people. And Herschel Walker shows up, and I could have told the people in Georgia what was going to happen because I saw it happen already. What he does after you mortgage your future, he basically takes the ball, bounces around behind the line of scrimmage a little bit, gets tackled for a loss, and then talks about himself in the third person afterwards. And it's like that's what you get, but it's like you're buying a bill of goods. And I see this whole conference as being like, to me, the Herschel Walker thing was just a metaphor. Like they're putting their faith in him. He's going to win. He's
Yeah.
going to win the seat back. And, yeah.
Yeah, that one was one of the hard, well, they were all hard to swallow, but I remember when that was happening. But here's a guy who had 3 kids out of wedlock that and there was an article that came out exposing all this just before this election in Georgia for him. But he had 3 kids out of wedlock, none of whom he's ever publicly acknowledged. He had terrorized his wife, put a gun to her head, threatening to murder her, um,
Hmm.
and uh, like none of that. And and the other thing about having 3 kids out of wedlock, but never acknowledging their existence.
Hmm.
One of his big um, things was confronting black men who are leaving their families. Shut up,
Mm.
fucker. Go support
Right.
your. Same thing with
Right.
abortion. I think he had paid for some people's abortions, and his own son came on.
Right.
It's just like unbelievably blatant hypocrisy,
Right.
lying, pretending I'm a God guy, and he throws out a verse that no weapon formed against me shall ever prosper. Thus says the Lord, and people buy it. That's it.
Right.
He says it. It's just like Paula White when I go, no, that's ridiculous. Oh, they're paying attention to
Yeah.
this
Right.
stuff.
That's the hard part.
Ending with,
That's the hard
well,
part.
I know. Let's go back to Jesus' day. I like this using a biblical kind of analogy. And in Jesus' day, there were a lot of people who were anticipating a kingdom. They all wanted the kingdom. They didn't
Hmm.
always get an understanding what that meant. But the thing they really missed was the way the kingdom would come. So the kingdom of heaven is coming. It's within your reach. There were miracles, and there was also sorts of good news. He was going to be the messianic fulfillment of God's promise. But Peter is a great example of someone who never got and was consistently resistant to the way the kingdom would come, and it wasn't going to come in a power over way. It was going to come in some ways through suffering and death, resurrection after that. But 3 examples of that would be I think it was around the transfiguration, and maybe just before, just after. Jesus announces and turns his head toward Jerusalem. He announces, I must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things, and be killed by the chief priests and scribes, and then be raised from the dead. Peter doesn't hear the be raised from the dead part, but it's that famous place where Peter says, "May it never be." No, you can't, because he can't get his head around the idea that part of the unleashing of the kingdom's power might come through a descent into dying that would result in a resurrection and ascent. So he can't get his head around that. He doesn't get the way. He just doesn't understand the story. And Jesus is really rough on me. He says, "Get behind me, Satan," because you're standing in, you don't understand at all this way. Well, fast forward it to another scene that we're pretty familiar with. It's in the context of the Last Supper. So it's just days before he. So by this time, you'd think they'd get it. Jesus gets up from the table. Remember this? And he takes off his garments, wraps a towel around his waist, takes a basin of water, and kneels down and begins to whitewash. He begins to wash the disciples' feet. And again, famously, if you know the story at all, Peter says, "No, Lord, you cannot wash my feet." He pushes him away. Why? I think part of why was that Jesus was taking on, when he took his clothes off, put on a towel, pretty much naked, kneels down to wash their feet. All of that was what slaves and servants do. It's not what a king does. And I think Peter was not alone, but I think part of what Peter's problem was this was a symbolic gesture. Prophets were always doing symbolic gestures that meant something without words. And what Peter is kind of saying by, "I don't want you acting like my servant, because I want a king." When I'm thinking of the kingdom of God and kings wear royal robes. They don't wear towels around their waist. And kings are bowed down too. They don't bow down to me. I don't want that kind of king. Kings have power over and he was rejecting the kind of king that this symbolic gesture of Jesus's did. He eventually yielded to it, but I don't think he ever understood. And the last one is in the Garden of Gethsemane, when they came with clubs and swords to arrest Jesus. Peter pulls out the sword. We talked about this one earlier, but again, I kind of get it, because if they come at me with clubs and swords and lanterns in the middle of the night, the end justifies the means. Come on. You don't respond to clubs and swords with a "please don't do that." You respond with a sword. I think we did talk about this the other day. This is where the end does justify the means, and I pull out sword. And all I'm saying is that it's clear Peter, God bless him, never understood the way of Jesus. It took a very long time for him to get it. It's where I do have some compassion, and because I think that's where people stumble today. They don't have any intention. They've accepted Jesus as their savior, so they go to heaven when they die. That's their version of the gospel. They have no intention of or understanding of what it means to follow the way of Jesus.
Right. Yeah. And I think, that whole thing about the washing the feet, I've been thinking about that this week, because, there was this big Super Bowl ad that ran where people were washing the feet, and it was supposed to be, do this to people that you wouldn't expect to serve, serve people you wouldn't expect to serve, and cause controversy, because everything causes controversy. And but I've been thinking about it, that I think you're hitting it on the head when you talk about how Peter was like, I don't want my leader to be this sort of person. It wasn't that Peter felt bad for Jesus, debasing himself this way. Peter felt bad for Peter.
Oh yeah.
Because the guy that he's following is debasing himself. You know what I mean? It's but and I see and I see also, that with go ahead.
Well, it's also that I think woven into that, so Peter isn't totally stupid, because woven into that gesture of his leader is that he's my rabbi, and if he's doing this, he's calling me to do this. I don't want that.
Right.
I don't
exactly.
I don't want it.
And that kind of thinking brings me back to this conference that Alberta was at, where,
Mhm.
because I've always looked at people like Paula White and all the health and wealth people who are flying around in these jets, and I just think, how do people not see how they're being fleeced? I look at whether it's Herschel Walker or other political leaders, Donald Trump, who are obviously you know corrupt in a lot of different ways, or you know and I think, how do people not see it? And I think they do see it. There's something about it where it's like, I want my leader to be, if they're telling me about health and wealth, I want them to be flying in the best plane possible.
Yep.
I don't want them, you know washing my feet. I want them soaring because they're representing me, and I'm the one in the plane up there with them. And that, when, no matter how this person got this political power, now I'm sitting in the seat of power because the person that I'm following is the one that's in that seat of power. And I just think it gets at something really deep inside of us, and Jesus just kind of was dismantling that when he took off his clothes and got down and washed the feet. I think he was dismantling all of that, but I think it's a very hard thing to come to grips with.
Yeah. But it's not confusing. It's clear.
No. Right.
And I don't, it just, when we talk like this, it makes the chasm between that Jesus who is showing us how to be, you see
Mm-hmm.
the Gentiles and their great men and women lord it over. It's not to be so among
Mm-hmm.
you. The way we're going to do it in the kingdom is to serve, the first will be last, all that stuff. Uh,
Right.
the chasm between that kind of learning how to follow that and flying around in jets and
Mm-hmm.
declaring this is what it looks like when you have the right faith. You
Right.
use the word heresy. I would put a swear word in there somewhere because it's not even.
Mm-hmm.
It's just bizarre
Right.
to me.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to think of
And
what get.
that's why we're that's why we're doing these talks, and I think it's safe to say that you and I both have enough humility to know that we also are, you know wired to want a lot of the same things that these
Sure.
people want. And it's like, it's this constant journey that we're on. As if you're a follower of Christ, you're in a constant journey of having these things dismantled and having to be reminded, oh, that's right, it's not about this,
Mhm.
it's
Right.
and where I get really kind of angry with some of these leaders that are showing up, like at this conference in this book, is that they're not helping people dismantle it. That they're instead feeding off of the sickness, feeding off of the false system, and reinforcing it.
Yeah, and we've
Which is
talked
why
about
we do
that too
these
before. Like we
podcasts.
have two ticks, no dog. There is
Yeah.
a mutual. I do, the multitude. Jesus looked at the multitude and said, "They're sheep. They don't have a shepherd." So I can look at them that way. The other is though that I was at Jeremiah thing where there's a horrible thing that's gone on in the land. My prophets prophesy
Mm-hmm.
falsely. So that makes me mad at leaders. And my people love
Mm-hmm.
it. So they just suck it up. I mean, one of the phrases that you got close to that is in this chapter, Alberta, is describing the crowd at Ralph Reed's
Mm-hmm.
event as being like starving animals. And they're throwing
Mm-hmm.
all of this, they're coming for you. You got to pick up your gun. We got to fight really hard at these, and they're just devouring
Yeah.
this
Right.
because that's what they
Right.
want. That's what they want.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I would encourage people to, as always, read this chapter. Uh, by this time, if you've listened to, like, this is, I think, our tenth podcast about it. It's chapter 9, and we did a prologue. So if you're this far into it, you might agree with us that this book is worth getting, because we're just talking about a few issues coming out of it, but it's just reading the depictions of what's going on in this. I think it should be an eye opener. And so thanks, Dave,
You
for
bet.
having this conversation, and we'll take on the next one in a few days here. And I just appreciate your time, and thank you, everybody, for listening.